Welcome to our business webinar program presented by Bank of America. Today's session is titled Understanding ESG, and we will learn what ESG is and isn't, how your environmental, sustainability, and governance practices shape your company's policies. We're going to talk about some of the key federal and international regulations, and talk also about what mission-driven companies need to know about advancing their values. I'm Desiree Brown, Senior Manager of Digital Education and Content here at the Tory Burch Foundation, and I am so excited to be here today with Danielle Corcione. Danielle is a law firm executive and equity partner at CSG Law, where she holds several managerial roles, including chair of the firm's litigation department, ESG and sustainability group, and as a member of the firm's governing group. Danielle is former in-house counsel in the beauty industry and is a former federal prosecutor who helps companies and founders mitigate risk by providing strategic advice grounded in ESG principles. So we are in very good hands as we are talking about a topic that really seems to be changing day by day. So after today's presentation, we will have plenty of time for a Q&A, so be sure to ask your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. We'd love to keep the chat for that community building, those responses, and all of your questions for Danielle in the Q&A box. We encourage you to take notes as you follow along, and as a quick reminder, today's session will be recorded, so please watch your inbox for the replay link and a handout from Danielle. And so with that, let's get started. Over to you, Danielle.
Hi, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I want to thank the Tory Burch Foundation for inviting me to speak with all of you today. It is an incredible opportunity to be with this community, and I have a lot of wisdom to share, and I'm hoping that you'll walk away from today with some knowledge and some practical advice as to how best to run your organization. As Desiree mentioned, by way of background, I'm a former federal prosecutor. I spent 5 years as an assistant United States attorney for the District of New Jersey, where I represented the United States in criminal cases. Prior to that, I was in the legal department of a global beauty brand. And so as a result, I'm able to understand both sides of the aisle. What does government expect from industry, and how does it actually work in practice to run a business in compliance with the federal, state, and local rules. Today, I'm a partner at CSG Law, and I serve on the firm's executive committee, as Desiree mentioned. And so that allows me to be part of the firm's governing body. And so it is just such an honor to be here with you today, and look forward to digging in. So let me get into our deck. Okay, hopefully everyone can see my screen. Okay, so what is ESG and sustainability? You may have heard this term before. ESG is a process that leads to a policy to support sustainable business goals. Now, those are a lot of words, and we're going to break them down and really dig in and understand what we're talking about here. ESG, the actual acronym, stands for environmental, social, and governance. And essentially, it's a business strategy that becomes embedded in the culture of an organization to drive growth and profitability. So as mentioned, it's an ongoing process of engaging stakeholders. So I know that the audience here has varying degrees of maturity in their organizations. You may have a really robust compliance program. You may be, a solopreneur just getting started. And so what we're hoping to do today is frame the conversation into what ESG is, so you can understand the business opportunity for today and for the future. And so it's an ongoing process of engaging stakeholders to identify and mitigate material risks and to seize opportunities by setting goals that are important to you, to your brand, to your consumer, and to your customer base. So it is not a topic that can be left just to one individual or one department. The most successful sustainable companies do have a cross-functional approach, and it is the responsibility of every team member to incorporate ESG strategies and principles into their day-to-day work. So environmental, it's the impact on the planet. Pollution, energy efficiency, resource depletion, hazardous materials. So what does that mean? So you want to think about the materials you use to create your product. And the question is whether or not it impacts the environment negatively. So for instance, what type of packaging do you use? If you're a brand where, circularity can be a part of your product, is that baked into the design of the product, right down to the shipping? So what sort of packaging and shipping do you use? Speaking of shipping, transportation. How does your product get to your consumer? Is there a way for your organization to ensure that the carbon footprint of your product, of your brand, is not negatively impacting the environment? And it also goes to waste, as we were talking, as I was mentioning about shipping, right? What do you actually need in your packaging? Certainly, you want to make sure that it is a beautiful package, and your consumer will feel very special when they receive the package. But you also want to make sure you're using supplies and materials that are not damaging the environment. Another thing to think about for, some of the brands that might be on today's webinar have to do with how your teams connect, right? So today we're connecting via video conference. And so that's a really easy way to ensure that you are not negatively impacting the environment, right? Are you taking, team members from across the country to come to an offsite? Certainly that is necessary for culture building and for a variety of business reasons, but is that always the highest and best use of the resources of the organization? Um, when you talk about the E, the environmental, and we'll get into specific regulations later, it's really, you want to frame it around traceability and transparency. So consumers want to know, and some regulators require, for the product to be able to be traced right down to the source. Who created it? What materials are in it? Are there any, dangerous chemicals in the product? Um, and so, making sure that your actual end game, what goes out to the market, is safe and it's effective, sourced ethically, and without damaging the local ecosystem. The S stands for social. And for social, consumers are demanding sustainable products, and consumers want to see that brands are ethically producing the products they sell. And that comes down to a company's purchase power and risk management. And so focusing on, this is the people, this conversation was framed around people, planet, and profitability. Obviously the environmental was the planet aspect, and we'll get into that further, but we're talking about people when we talk about social. So let's start with your employees. I mean, you may have a very small team, right? But what's the culture of your organization? Does your company have a code of conduct that your team can rely upon? Does your organization have a mission statement? Is your brand living its values? Or is it all smoke and mirrors? Because companies who are living their own mission tend to be more successful and tend to be more profitable, because they are able to really genuinely and authentically connect with their consumer. Next, focusing on the community. How does your brand show up in the community at all? So does your organization give back in time or resources? When there is a crisis in your community, does your brand, in whatever small way it can, meet that crisis? That is something that consumers care about. Are you a socially conscious brand? And this is the biggest one, is supply chain. And sometimes, you understand in your creation of your product exactly where it comes from, right? Maybe you're a really small company and the product is made at your kitchen table. But as you grow and as you scale and as you are bringing different stakeholders to the table to bring your brand to market, you may lose that sense of control as to who has access to the end product of what you're creating. And so I'd really encourage you, as you continue to grow and think about where your company is going, um, to know who you're doing business with. And I always recommend that companies have a vendor code of conduct or a third party vendor agreement to have its suppliers comply with the expectations of your organizations. So what does that mean? For any issue that you care about, you can require your suppliers to meet your needs. So for instance, you can't assume that a supplier or manufacturer has fair working conditions for its employees, right? You as you're now the consumer of this product, the parts that go into your end product. um, you can demand that the working conditions are safe, or at least you can audit and you can find out, right? You could say you can do what you need to do to figure out whether or not the working conditions are safe. Are the employees of the supplier, are they getting time off for meals? Are they getting necessary breaks? Are they free from harassment and abuse? And conducting due diligence on your suppliers is not only, the right thing to do for you to understand who you're working with, but it also protects the brand, because you want to make sure that you're aligned with individuals and companies that are aligned with your values. And so, one of the biggest issues that happens in the supply chain is that a company will know who their direct supplier is, right? But they maybe contract out further down the supply chain, and that's where the risk comes in for sustainability. And the sustainability in this context is, how are people being treated? Is there child labor? Are there human rights violations? Those are things that are very easy to ignore that are there, but with a simple due diligence checklist, or requiring your vendor to have the right compliance in their own affairs, will protect your brand. Um, and it helps you mitigate risk. When I'm a former federal prosecutor, and so I help companies do internal investigations. When there are allegations of potential wrongdoing, what I'm recommending here is for your brand to understand who you're doing business with and continue to monitor that relationship um, during the course of your business relationship, so that you can be sure that what you put out in the market is produced ethically and in a way that you would expect it to. And another way to put this is, it's a know your supplier assessment. And just like your customers have purchase power as to whether or not they would like to purchase your goods or services, you have a choice who you do business with as well. And having the ability to ask good questions and ask for certifications that you would expect your suppliers to have. It's not being annoying. It's not being difficult. It's just being a smart and ethical business owner. Another aspect of this social is data protection and privacy. And so, how can your customers and your employees be sure that their data is safe? So, an easy way to ensure that would be to have a privacy policy in place and follow it. Is the cybersecurity of your system strong enough to protect against cyber attacks? And what happens if there is a cyber attack, because they happen all the time? Do you have a plan in place to inform, your customer, your employees, and if necessary, regulators, in accordance with local or state or federal law if data has been compromised? And it's how you respond to things when they may go wrong, which also does enhance the trust that the market has with your brand, if you are being forthcoming and truthful. Um, Other things you can think about from the social aspect for ESG is, if there's a cause that's important to you and maybe your customer base, you can commit sales proceeds to a relevant cause. We've seen that many times, and that not only is good for the cause that you care about, but consumers want to spend their money where good is being done. So, another way to deal with that is aligned partnerships. If you're a clothing company, having size inclusive or adaptive clothing, lots of different ways to make sure that your brand is considering all people. Governance. We're going to talk a little bit about what the governance piece of the G for ESG, and it's how your business is actually run. So your company might be really small and you care about integrity and you care about ethics, but you don't actually have a board yet. So you might want to consider having an informal advisory board. That may be more appropriate. I've seen that happen. A lot of small companies will have their own personal board of directors become the company's board of directors. And, this seems like something you're probably already doing from a governance perspective. A way to protect your brand is to memorialize that. Set up board agreements with your informal advisory board and make sure that the relationship is codified such that, a time comes where you're able to potentially get investment from friends and family or a third party, you're able to show that your house is in order. Um, Compliance is a really a big part of governance. As in-house counsel at a global beauty brand, the thing I loved the most was working directly with the business to ensure that they were running the business appropriately and in compliance with the law, which is always changing. And one thing that you can do to make sure that your company is um, compliant is, certainly lawyers are really expensive. There's options to have outside general counsel or fractional general counsel. I serve as outside general counsel for smaller brands. There's lots of options to get the resources you need. And I'd recommend that you start in having compliance be part of your organization and have it integrated into the culture of the organization. And ways to do that, again, as I mentioned earlier, what your consumers and what your employees may expect is to have a code of conduct and corporate values that are, they're really integral to good governance. So your board, if you do have one, what's its composition? Does it reflect diversity of thought? And so you'll want to think about who's sitting on your board, and does that board mirror the business that you want to put out? And also, what happens when something goes wrong? Because sometimes it does. As your organization matures, or if you have a more robust compliance program and mature organization, you may have a compliance hotline. And that allows not only the employees, but third parties who may have come across your brand just in the market to anonymously report potential wrongdoing. And that allows you to know if you have an issue. Maybe there's a blind spot. Maybe you don't necessarily see something that happens, at a smaller portion of the company, or maybe you don't necessarily have access to, three people down from you where maybe potentially something's not going right. This can range from unethical behavior that can be reported through the hotline to potentially criminal conduct, breakdowns in the supply chain. I've seen allegations of sexual harassment come through the hotline. But allowing the anonymous reporting is, as much as it feels risky to do that, to open a line, like, please tell me everything that potentially could go wrong. The brands that want to know are the brands that fix it. And the brands that fix it have trust with the market. And so I highly recommend you having some sort of mechanism. And maybe at the stage of your company right now, it's, reach out to me, or, click here to be in touch. Just have some sort of ability for the market to reach you directly, because it allows you to protect your brand and avoid reputational risk. And risk management really is the name of the game with ESG. Okay. So there might be a misconception around ESG that, it's for people who love bumblebees and Birkenstocks, and those things are great, and it's good for the bumblebees, and Birkenstocks are comfortable. But that's not why companies set ESG principles. They do it for core business reasons. They do it to secure capital, to avoid reputational risks, and to attract and maintain customers and talent that they want to see in their organization, because the laws also mandate certain aspects of ESG. So as you get bigger, socially conscious brands are more profitable when they are living their values. Essentially, customers want to feel good about who they're doing business with. So let's talk about some of the regulations. So there are ESG regulations in the European Union, and I've listed some of them here. And really what it comes down to is transparency and accountability. So consumers want to know what they're spending money on. So there's some deforestation regulations. There's the digital product passport, which requires products to have a QR code to source right down to where the ultimate end product emanated from. So the materials used, the manufacturing location, what is the fibers, the actual base of the product. So the CSRD is the Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive. It's an EU directive that expands reporting requirements to include sustainability. And this includes your carbon footprint, greenhouse emissions, supply chain, labor conditions. So, if you're a company operating in, the EU, this is, would be something that eventually would be something you need to comply with. And so it's a global market, right? And I'm sure the hope for everyone is that they have a global brand, or maybe not everyone, but maybe that is, a hope one day is to have a global brand. And so you need to be able to operate in a global market and comply with rules, not just in the United States. But there are rules in the United States. The SEC has ESG reporting requirements, and it does include an adoption of final rules to disclose climate-related information in registration statements and annual reports. Now, this is for a registered company, but this is something that is required in the United States. And this idea of greenwashing, we haven't spoken about that, but that's the idea that not overstating something is organic when it's not, or vegan when it's not, or good for the environment when it's not, right? So there's accountability. And again, like if I leave you with anything, it's traceability, transparency, and accountability. You want to be able to stand by the statements that you make in marketing and advertising. So I thought it'd be helpful to talk a little bit about the New York State Fashion Act, just as a demonstrative of how state laws can impact you, even if you aren't in that state, if you're selling there. So this is a local law, but it could have a global reach for brands that meet the law's criteria. And you see the criteria here. And essentially, it imposes due diligence requirements. And we spoke about that a little bit around the supply chain, relating to environmental and human rights issues, amongst other. Certainly, these are brands that have a global revenue of $100 million or more. And the impact here would be to regulate where there hasn't been regulation before in, a fashion capital of the world. There's a little bit more information about the Fashion Act. I didn't want to read to you. You can see that here. But again, it comes down to informed consumers. And then there's this intersection of ESG and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So some of the EU rules do require disclosure of the composition of diversity for administrative, management, and supervisory bodies of the organization. And there are additional workforce disclosure that's required. But it is an ever-shifting landscape. We have some Supreme Court cases here in the United States that have disallowed race-based college admissions, and also came before the Supreme Court sex discrimination, requiring some sort of disadvantaged change. So the landscape it's not one way or the other. It's really shifting. And then the most recent case is an SEC case where the NASDAQ diversity, equity, inclusion rules were disallowed, and saying that you can no longer have quotas for certain diverse candidates for various portions of the board. And then, there's the executive orders that are moving very fast, and we are still assessing and figuring how that impacts industry. Just yesterday, the SEC had a statement on climate-related disclosure rules. There's a case pending in the Eighth Circuit where they're determining whether or not the climate rules I mentioned earlier in the presentation are enforceable, and the SEC just yesterday put a pause in that. So, reading between the lines, it may be that they may no longer enforce those climate rules, but it's still too soon to tell. But with this slide, I just want you to understand that, and I'm sure everyone does, that the landscape is moving very, very fast. Okay. So wanting to focus now back on culture and compliance, because it really comes down to what's important to your organization. And I would encourage you to focus on the word impact. There are anticipated changes in legislation in the United States, but it's too soon to determine whether or not that will impact long-term business models. But for you as a leader of your organization, I highly encourage you to take a look at the impact your organization intends to make and has made, and be thoughtful and slow down to assess next steps. And I'd recommend that you define your market impact on your own terms, because if you are following your own compass, then you can't look to your left and the right to figure out what to do. You're just looking straight ahead as to what is good for your business. And while it may seem that things are moving really fast, that there should be a reaction, I'd recommend that you drill down on your core values and recommit to ensure your business decisions are not based on any sort of political rhetoric, but what is right for your organization. And, there's been some a conversation in the market by some market leaders. So Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan, has stated that in the quote, where this was last year, he says, I'm going to start by telling, this is to the female quotient, I'm going to start by telling you that I'm a full-throated, red-blooded, patriotic, unwoke, capital CEO, and yet in an interview with CNBC at the World Economic Forum in Davos in January, he boldly stated in speaking to potential critics of diversity, equity, inclusion, he stated, bring them on, and reaffirm the bank's commitment to diversity. And Sergio Ermati, who's the UBS CEO, in February, he said, nothing has changed when speaking about diversity. He said, diversity plays a role at every level, while also never forgetting that a meritocracy has to be at the forefront of any decision. Apple, the board opposes a proposal to abolish diversity, equity, inclusion programs. And they stated, we strive to create a culture of belonging where everyone can do their best work. And the Costco board stated that attacks on diversity aren't just bad for business, they hurt our economy. So there is some pushback in both directions. So how do you protect your company? That's what we're doing here, right? We want to make sure that your company has meaningful and effective policies to implement its goals, and making sure that you are not misaligned with your policies, and to be able to commit to what to be able to have a policy that you can commit to, because there's nothing worse from a risk perspective than having a policy and not being able to implement it, right? That's worse. I'd rather you not have a piece of paper. I'd rather you just, move forward with your brand and try to incorporate good governance and all of these other ESG principles. But when you commit to having a policy, it has to be a policy that you can implement, because otherwise an aspirational policy that can't be complied with just creates reputational risk and, potential legal liability. And so getting to the heart of, well, what do you do with all of this? How do I implement this in my company? How does this actually work? And what I would recommend is that your culture rules. So be inclusive to protect against the rulings of the Supreme Court. So if you're going to have an event, make sure everyone's invited. Um, and when you talk about culture, it is not something that, I spoke earlier about a mission statement or your core values or your code of conduct. All of that's really important, but it doesn't matter. Culture really is in the heart of your employees and how they feel coming to work on Monday morning. So, if it matters to your company, if anything that we've discussed so far matters to your company, continue to make it matter because culture rules. And, like I said earlier, it's still too soon to say which way, the current landscape will land. And so, just by way of hoping that we can continue this conversation, I chair the firm's litigation department and ESG and sustainability practice. And I provide clients with guidance on strategic counseling, defending litigation, conducting investigations, helping mitigate risk and enhance good governance. So if there's anything that I can be helpful on, you'll have my contact information. Please reach out. And, whether it's me or some other lawyer, all of this is work where you can get the guidance and the advice that you need, and it's not something that you should operate blindly and in the dark. You should really get the team around you to help you. And I know that it is an expensive endeavor to do that, but sometimes spending money on the front end really does save you heartache on the back end, both in potential reputational harm and being careful not to be sued for anything. So I think we're just at the 35-minute mark, and let's answer some questions. I don't know if anyone has any, but I'm here, the best I can to answer questions for you.
Yes. So thank you, Danielle. We definitely have some questions. And I want to go back to something that you touched on, but just to really ground us, how can a founder understand what the significant environmental and social considerations are for their business?
Well, I think a risk assessment, and that sounds like a very fancy word, but really it's just taking a look at your business and understanding, what your options are for creating your product, right? So for instance, if you are a beauty brand and you're creating, skincare, are you using chemicals that are harmful, right? And if you are, is there an alternative that you can use? Are you looking around corners to how you are impacting the environment?
Yeah. Yes, that's great. And again, as you said that you said that things are moving very quickly, and also slowly at the same time. And so what do you see as the future of business and purpose?
The future business and purpose
Mhm.
in relations to ESG?
Yes.
Okay. So the issue is that sustainability is not going anywhere. It is whether or not it is driven by government or it is driven by industry. Consumers care about what they put in their body, what they put on their back, how they spend their money, and whether or not it's going to be regulated and mandated. It's not going anywhere. And if you see, um, what I guess the question is like, what to do going forward? It sounds like I'm punting and I'm really not. What to do going forward is to what you've always done, right? What you think is the best thing for your brand, as long as you are in compliance with the laws. And look, you have to comply with the laws. You can't not comply with the law, but there's ways to do it in a way that is aligned with your company's mission and what you're trying to accomplish.
Yes. Always follow the law. That's a good thing when it comes to business, regardless of ESG or anything else. Okay, let's see. Oh, here is a great question. It came in our Q&A. So we have some companies joining us who perhaps don't have physical products. Maybe they're an investment firm or they're some kind of service provider,
Mhm.
but they're still concerned about how they can consider their environmental impact. What should they be looking at?
Sure. So there's lots of ways to, whether or not you have, let's assume you're a service provider, I'm a service provider, I'm a law firm partner, I provide legal services, right? So, how do we as an organization, ensure that we are thinking about the environment? I mean, one easy way to do it is to have get rid of single-use plastic, right? When you're having a meeting, have glass water bottles at your meeting, have glass coffee cups instead of paper. You can have a paperless workplace, right? That you can ensure that you have really good systems so that you can have a paperless workplace and have it be a digital management system for organizations that are service providers. Again, I mentioned this during the talk. You can have video conferences instead of in-person meetings. Especially, I didn't really speak about this too much, but for financial providers, you know, many investors want to make socially conscious investments, and so, ESG is absolutely baked into that uh, industry.
And so we have a lot of acronyms flying around these days, and in a way that maybe they weren't before. And so I would love if you could help us understand a little bit of the evolution of ESG and its connection to CSR, corporate social responsibility. Where do these overlap? If just so we're really clear on how or if they work together.
Right. So I guess I would back it up a little bit more. So sustainability is, it lives in an organization, right? How does an organization function? What sort of impact is an organization having on the world? And when you take a look at, corporate social responsibility, that's almost ESG is the sustainability is the end game. ESG is the process to get there,
Mm.
right? So they are the policies and the framework to help your organization become a sustainable organization, right? So do you have, again, very like brass tacks, do you have the policies in place so that your employees know how to operate within the function of the structure of what is expected of them, right? And starting with people, I think is the best place to start, and making sure that you have a workforce that is trained regularly, right? It's not enough. This is an on. It's when I say a process, it's an ongoing process. It's not a one and done, because as I mentioned on the presentation, it's evolving. The rules change. And then they change back, and then they change again. And so if you're constantly ping ponging on what is popular opinion, you may miss out on what your company's, again, talking about corporate responsibility, what your company feels is its mission, what your company feels is its obligation to society.
And I mean, I love that. And I just want to make sure I'm understanding. So corporate social responsibility or does tie into a company's mission or how it wants to show up in the world. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. It's
Okay.
always about, it's all evolving, right? It's just acronyms. And very simply put, it's like, what kind of business do you want to be? How do you want to show up in the world? What impact is your brand going to make? Are you going to have um, an example would be if you're an organization and you have the ability, again, speaking from a law firm, we have the ability to do pro bono legal work, right? Like that's part of the culture of where I work, is that, you give back and you do pro bono legal work for individuals and organizations who need that help, right? That's contributing to society. Um,
Can you repeat that last part? I think I may have missed it.
Oh, just, just an example from my own background, right? I'm a lawyer, but I also
Mhm.
feel responsibility to do pro bono legal work, right? So to help indigent individuals or corporations who don't necessarily have, the ability to hire, a big law firm to do the work, but need, excellent legal work. Pro bono work is part of, my own personal corporate responsibility.
I love that. And I love that you're able to do that at your firm. Okay, so one last kind of acronym, maybe not an acronym, but a term that we want to clarify, B Corp. What does it mean for a company to have a B Corp status? And it is typically kind of time consuming and costly. But if you could just ground us in what that actually means for the way a company operates, and what the kinds of standards, just broadly, that it would have to meet.
Sure. So that's, an external certification that a company can comply for. It's similar to a Mansfield certification. There's all different certifications that a company can apply to, a certified vegan, right? To make sure, like, let's say you make, a granola bar and you certify that it's you tell the market that it's a vegan granola bar. Well, you better be sure that every piece of ingredient that's in that granola bar through your supply chain is actually produced in a way that you can say it's vegan, right? To have the certification that it is vegan. So that just comes, it's an external marker, right? And so it's not government, it's private. You're applying for that certification. You're getting reviewed by a third party. So that's just taking a look at how you would want it's alignment, right? Is there a external check mark that you believe would make your brand have more street cred, for lack of a better word, right? You know, I'm really excited to be doing this with the Tory Burch Foundation, right? I now have more street cred. Like, that's a great thing for me. So if you want to work with another brand, and put your money to get that certification, just make sure you feel like that is the right certification to align with. I don't know a ton about B Corp. I haven't helped any companies try to comply with that, but I know that it is a gold standard.
Um, it is a gold standard, and I know that there are big and exciting companies that have them. So certainly, it sounds like it may be worth the time and cost once your company is at that level. Um, but how else might brands who are excelling and are committed to people, planet, and profit communicate their achievements and successes?
So social media is an incredible thing, right? I mean, you have free marketing in so many different platforms, and I would recommend that if you are a brand that, for instance, gives a percentage of your sales to a cause that is dear to your community, well, then make sure people know about it, right? Post about it on LinkedIn and other platforms that you work on. Have aligned partnerships. If you are doing um, if you're doing an event with a group that you feel is a good alignment, make sure people know about that. Know your suppliers. That's a big one, right? And making sure that it comes down to as Kit said this earlier, it's
Mhm.
transparency, traceability, and accountability, right? You want to make sure that you're not a founder that has her head in the sand and she doesn't understand exactly like where this is coming from. And, well, I have this contract with this really great supplier, but I have no idea how many times that has been subcontracted out, right? Ask the questions, understand who's being part of your brand, and when you do feel good about it, make sure people know what you're doing. um, and as far as a governance perspective, having good governance from the beginning is very, very helpful. And you can reach out to fractional general counsel. You can reach out to there's various. I'm sure there's options on with the Troy Bridge Foundation where you can get some information about how to set up your organization in a compliant way, and lean on those resources. Get the help when you need, but at least make the effort, right?
Of course. And on the subject of resources and suppliers, is there a database of US based ethically run suppliers? Or is there some sort of certification or designation that small companies can either look for in suppliers or apply for to highlight their own efforts?
That's a really good question. There's lots of different companies that give check marks. I wouldn't necessarily be able to say to you right now that I would align with this one or the other, but we can chat offline and I can give you some resources to share after the webinar.
Great. And as a reminder, we will be sharing Danielle's information. So please watch your inboxes. Okay, let's see. What other questions do we have? Okay, so on the subject of good governance from the beginning, what are some of those foundational things that companies need to think about? I know that we've talked about suppliers, but internally, what are kind of the top three things that a founder should start with?
Sure. So I would definitely start with a mission statement or
Mhm.
your own internal values, your core criteria of what sort of company you want to be. I would start there. And then it's really important for your employees to have an employee handbook, for there to be a code of conduct. You want to make sure that your own house is in order, that people understand what's expected of the employees of the organization, and what you expect of your suppliers and third parties that you work with, right? That, an example would be, from a privacy perspective, you might collect data of your customers, and you might use a third party to collect that. Well, what does that third party do with that data, right? If someone wants to align with you and they're like, yes, great, I'd love to learn more, and they click and they put their information, you're not the one that's necessarily hosting that and understanding what happens in the event of a data breach unless you ask those questions, right? So when you talk about good governance, it's having the compliance in place, so that you are asking the right questions of, look, you can only control yourself, and you can control like how you show up as a business person, but you can also demand excellence of the people you work with, right? And the best way to do that is to understand what might happen. And this is, look, as a former federal prosecutor, I have seen every bad thing happen, right? Like, I've done internal investigations based on allegations of fraud and abuse, sexual misconduct, um, fraud at the highest levels. And so you could see like potentially what might go wrong. So I really encourage you to work with someone who understands the risks to help you mitigate them from the front, right? So you're a founder, you're a businesswoman, you're doing the work to get your product out to market or your service out to market. You might not be thinking of the parade of horribles, and you'd be wise to speak to somebody who knows what might go wrong, right? So you can avoid it. And I mean, it's a concept that I think about, is that like, we all have our strong suits. There's lots of things I don't know how to do. And when I don't, I ask someone who does, because I'm not trying to pretend that I, you know, can do something I'm not capable of, or I don't necessarily have the expertise. And you don't have the time to figure it out. Like, go work with a subject matter expert that can help you.
That is great advice. And we are always talking to our founders about reaching out and calling on those other resources because you can't do everything yourself. Um, but that being said, there's of course the question of the websites or resources that are credible, that are going to have the most up-to-date regulations. Do you have any resources that you'd recommend just for a founder to at least be in the know and on top of things, know what questions to ask?
That's a really good question. I want to be thoughtful about what I recommend to this community. So if I could just take a little bit of time and put together kind of my top tips. There's lots of different, I mean, there's government websites you can take a look at. There are industry websites you can look at, trade organizations. There's certainly I have lots of ideas, but if I could just take a little bit of time and be more thoughtful and give you something that I could feel good about, and if that's okay.
Yes, of course. I appreciate you being intentional and careful, but I do like what you said about trade organizations, which again, the importance of as a founder, you can't do everything alone. Even as a solopreneur, you're going to have to ask questions and get some sort of support. Um, okay, let's see. What are their
To that
questions?
end, I've found, with some founders that I've worked with, that they get a lot of support in co-working spaces. Oftentimes, if you find yourself in a co-working space, there's someone who's done what you're doing, or is working with, an expert that you may not have come across. And so, this is it's the obvious advice, but really networking and letting people know what you're working on and letting people understand what your questions are. Because generally people want to help, right? Anytime anyone asks me for help, I want to help them. I want to open a door. I want to be able to make the introduction. But you can't do that if you don't know, right? So if you're working on something and you're unsure about it, talk to people.
Yes, we are always talking about the importance of networking, and that's why it's so great to see everyone, or not everyone, but plenty of people in the chat introducing themselves and offering their expertise, and thinking about how they can connect with people locally. Um, okay, so this is more in the implementation realm, this question. So a very small company has decided, or perhaps it's someone that's a one-person shop has decided um, they're going to get some policies in place. Um, what are some of the most, or how are companies measuring their impact? And are they using that data to then course correct?
Sure. I mean, there's so many third-party vendors that this is their entire job is to collect the data. I mean, the CRSD that we spoke about earlier, that is data collection. Companies are using AI to find, the information fast, so that if you're reporting on your carbon footprint or your emissions, you want to be able to access that data pretty easily, and it's for a larger company, sometimes the systems don't speak to one another, right? So sometimes, you've got all this information over here, but the people who are actually doing the work never got it. So for a smaller company, you might want to certainly, and this is simple, but not right. Getting good people around you. So have a good lawyer, have a good accountant, have a good marketing person, have the subject matter experts around you that know what they know to tell you, okay, well, let's make sure that we have, the right social media policy, or let's make sure, that's an easy one, right? You have a team, and you want to make sure that your team is the right brand ambassador for your organization. So an easy way for a small company to make sure that they're mitigating risk is just check out, what posts have been made about your company. What are people saying about your company? And is it, an employee? And is it, if it is an employee, is it something that's on brand? Right? These are things that you can keep an eye on.
Great. And so I love the idea of kind of that real world listening, and certainly having those good people around you. Let's see. And I think that this question perhaps is sort of on the other end of the spectrum, but what are some of the common pitfalls you see, um, or the common pitfalls, I'm sorry, excuse me, of establishing ESG practices?
Overpromising and underperforming.
Okay.
So the start small, do the things that you can do and you can do well.
Mhm.
I've seen companies go out front and say that they are carbon neutral and they're not, or they'll say this product is 100% organic or vegan or whatever it is, right? And it's not. So you don't want to make, and it seems so obvious, like ethical business, but sometimes you really maybe think it is. Maybe you really believe that the product is, the term is called greenwashing, right? Saying that it is, safe and effective and healthy, and however that's defined by whatever regulation, when in fact it's not. Someone saying that, an example would be, I'm thinking a real world example would be someone saying that this is, a health product. Well, what does that mean, right? This is great for your well-being. Well, how do you actually measure that, right? So having like studies, if you're a product, like having studies to support the claims that you make, that's really important. Clinical trials to support what you're saying. It all comes to data. So common pitfalls would be over promising, underperforming, or making claims that are just not truthful and accurate, even with best intentions.
Great. And earlier you touched on AI, and so we just want to backtrack if you could speak to AI ethics, safety, and privacy as part of the governance portion of ESG, are you seeing particular challenges and risks emerging that our community can be aware of?
Sure, AI is moving so fast. Don't get left behind. Women do not get left behind. We need female voices like in the AI space. The technology is being populated by people, right? So there may be biases baked into it, and the more women and the more diversity we have in the AI space, the better, because diversity of thought is important and good. So I would say don't get left behind. If you're interested in it, learn about it. I'm continuing to learn about it. It is changing the way we work. It is changing the way people show up. And it's making things, and don't be afraid of it. Learn about it.
Wonderful. So we are almost at time. Is there anything else, Danielle, that you want everyone here to know, to what is the one thing that they absolutely should not forget after our time with you today?
Well, thank you so much. I just am so grateful for this opportunity to be with this community. So thank you again to the Tory Burch Foundation. I would just recommend that everyone get quiet and think about what it is that's important to their brand. Like, really, like, sit down with a cup of coffee if you drink it, and a lit candle, and a quiet space. And what is it that is important to your brand? And make sure, do the data check. Go back and forth. Am I doing the work in a way that I intended? Because as you grow and you scale, sometimes you lose that. And so always go back to basics, and um, do do what you think is right in your own heart, and be guided by your own compass.
Time and again, our presenters talk to us about being grounded in your values. So I love to hear that brought up again in this context. And thank you again, Danielle, for your time.